The story of Seth unfolds against a backdrop of profound pain and mourning. Adam and Eve, the first human beings created by God, had experienced the joy of parenthood, but they also felt the weight of sin in its most devastating form. Cain and Abel, their two oldest sons, represent two paths: obedience and rebellion. While Abel stood out for his faithfulness to God, offering an accepted sacrifice, Genesis 4 verse 4, Cain chose the path of envy and sin, which culminated in the murder of his brother, Genesis 4 verse 8. Imagine for a moment what Adam and Eve must have felt. Not only did they lose Abel, who was righteous and pleasing in God's eyes, but they also had to deal with the consequences of Cain's sin, which further alienated him from God's presence. The Bible says that Cain was cursed and became a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, Genesis 4 verses 11 to 12. Two sons, two losses, one through physical death, the other through spiritual death. The birth of Seth brought Adam and Eve something that seemed lost: hope. After the tragedy involving Cain and Abel, God gave them a new son, who became a symbol of renewal. Seth was not just a son to fill the emotional void caused by Abel's death, he was a sign that God had not given up on humanity. Genesis 3 verse 15 contains a fundamental promise, that the woman's seed would crush the serpent's head. This prophecy pointed to a future Redeemer, one who would defeat evil and restore the broken relationship between God and mankind. When Abel was killed and Cain turned away, it seemed that God's plan was in jeopardy. But the birth of Seth brought the assurance that the promise lived on. Eve acknowledged this when she declared, "God has given me another seed in place of Abel, because Cain killed him," Genesis 4 verse 25. These words reveal their faith in divine sovereignty and the continuity of the redemptive plan. Seth, whose name means appointed or substitute, represented the beginning of a new lineage through which God would fulfill his promises. Furthermore, it was during the time of Enosh, Seth's son, that people began to call on the name of the Lord, Genesis 4 verse 26. This shows that Seth's lineage was marked by a return to worship and seeking God, in contrast to the rebellious lineage of Cain. Seth was more than a son to Adam and Eve. He was a symbol of God's grace in the midst of pain and proof that divine hope is never frustrated. He reminds us that even in the worst circumstances, God always has a greater plan for our lives. The Bible reveals to us a remarkable moment in the spiritual history of humanity linked to the lineage of Seth. In Genesis 4 verse 26 we read, "To Seth also a son was born, and he named him Enosh." At that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. This statement is more than just a record. It is a significant change in the way human beings began to relate to God. The birth of Enosh, Adam's grandson and Seth's son, marked the beginning of a spiritual movement in which people began to actively seek the Lord. But what does this mean? Calling on the name of the Lord implies recognizing his sovereignty, depending on him, and seeking his presence in prayer and worship. This practice was a milestone in the lineage of Seth, differentiating it from that of Cain, who turned away from God. The lineage of Seth was distinguished by a desire for communion with God, and this was essential in a world increasingly marked by sin and rebellion. This search was not automatic or inherited, it was intentional. This is a lesson for us today. A relationship with God does not happen by inertia or tradition. It is something that each of us must choose and cultivate. His lineage teaches us that, even in a corrupt world, it is possible to seek the Lord and live for him. It is a call for us to follow the same example, invoking the name of the Lord in our daily lives, trusting in his grace and walking in communion with him. After all, it is in seeking God that we find our true purpose. The scriptures present a sharp contrast between the lineages of Cain and Seth, revealing two opposite ways of living. Cain's lineage was marked by pride, violence, and a continual distancing from God. Seth's lineage stood out for its search for communion with the Lord. This contrast teaches us that, even in a world marked by sin, we can choose a path that honors God. Cain, after killing Abel, received a curse and became a fugitive on earth, Genesis 4 verses 11 to 12. His descendants followed the same pattern. A clear example is Lamech, one of his descendants, who prided himself on his violence and on having killed a man for an offense, Genesis 4 verses 23 to 24. This lineage is a portrait of a lifestyle in which God is ignored and values are corrupted. On the other hand, the lineage of Seth took a different path. It was through his descendants that a spiritual movement began, marked by the invocation of the name of the Lord, Genesis 4 verse 26. This demonstrates that, even in the worst circumstances, it is possible to seek God and live in a way that glorifies His name. This contrast highlights a universal choice: to follow the ways of a corrupt world or to live in obedience and communion with God. The lineage of Seth shows us that our origin or context does not define our destiny. Even coming from a humanity broken by sin, we can choose the path of faithfulness, worship, and service to God. This choice, although difficult, is essential. The example of the lineage of Seth is a reminder that God always calls a faithful remnant, willing to walk with Him. Seth was a crucial link in the lineage that would culminate in Noah, one of the most remarkable characters in the Bible. Through Seth, God began to rebuild the human lineage, preserving the plan of redemption amid the corruption of the world. Noah, described as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and one who walked with God, Genesis 6 verse 9, became God's answer to save humanity and keep His promise. Seth's role in history is significant because he not only brought new hope to his parents, but he also began a line of descent that kept faith in the Lord alive. Seth's descendants, in contrast to Cain's, sought God and were distinguished by their faithfulness. This line culminates in Noah, who was chosen by God to build the ark and save creation from the judgment of the flood, Genesis 6 verses 13 to 14. The story of Seth's lineage through Noah teaches us that God works through the generations, even in a world that is increasingly distant from His will. Although humanity has become corrupt, God found a righteous man in Seth's lineage, showing that His faithfulness never fails. He always raises up people willing to fulfill His purposes, regardless of the circumstances. Just as Seth was a starting point for a lineage of faith that culminated in Noah, we are also called to live in such a way that our actions and choices glorify God and influence future generations. After all, God continues to fulfill His plans through people who seek Him and remain faithful. Seth's legacy goes beyond being Abel's replacement. His lineage represents a milestone in the spiritual history of humanity. Although not perfect, Seth's lineage was marked by people who sought God and kept their faith alive in an increasingly corrupt world. One of the greatest highlights in Seth's lineage is the moment when people began to call on the name of the Lord, Genesis 4 verse 26. This reflects a search for communion with God, something essential in a world where many chose to live independently of Him. This movement of faith and worship did not arise by chance. It was built by generations who chose to pass on reverence and obedience to the Lord. However, Seth's legacy also reminds us that no one is perfect. Even in his lineage, over time, humanity turned away from God, to the point that the world is described as full of violence and evil, Genesis 6 verse 5. Yet, it was from this lineage that God raised Noah, a righteous man who found favor in the eyes of the Lord, Genesis 6 verses 8 to 9. This shows that even in the midst of sin and human weakness, God uses those who remain faithful to fulfill His plans. This makes us wonder, how are we influencing future generations? Are we teaching our children and those around us to seek God? The spiritual legacy we leave today can impact many lives tomorrow. Just as Seth's lineage pointed us to faith and worship, so too can we be instruments of God to pass on His truth and grace to future generations. Seth is a low-key character in the biblical narrative, but his impact is profound. He did not perform great deeds that would place him at the center of the Bible's stories, like other characters, but his role in the story of redemption is fundamental. Seth teaches us that we do not have to be protagonists to be important in God's plan. Sometimes, faithfulness in our daily lives is what counts most. This example reminds us that it is often through consistency and faithfulness in small acts that we leave a lasting legacy. Not everyone will be a leader or accomplish great things in human eyes, but those who remain faithful in their daily responsibilities are also essential in the divine plan. The story of Seth ends with the mention that men began to call on the name of the Lord. This challenges us to follow the same path, to seek God in prayer and communion every day. Seth may seem like a small character in the Bible, but his impact is immense. He is a reminder that God always has a plan, even in the midst of chaos. Just as Seth brought hope and continuity, we can trust that God is working in our lives to fulfill his promises. May we, like Seth and his lineage, live in a way that glorifies the Lord.